It's Thanksgiving season, which of course is a lot of people's favorite holiday. Even though, if we're really honest about this, a lot of us have actually forgotten how to be thankful. So today on Authentic, recovering the lost art of gratitude. So here we are. It's Thanksgiving season here in the United States. And I know I didn't say anything about Canadian Thanksgiving when it was October, so listen, my apologies to those of you living on the north side of the 49th parallel. I just hope you can still pull something useful out of today's subject. Just use it next October. Today I thought it would be nice to take a little break from some of the heavier subject matter that we usually talk about, and maybe just think about the fine art of gratitude, because well, the practice of thankfulness seems to be a bit of a lost art here in the modern West, especially in recent history. I mean, think about this. Here we are, one of the most privileged nations in the history of the world, and certainly one of the wealthiest. And I can testify firsthand as an immigrant and a naturalized American that we have an awful lot to be thankful for here. And yet, in some ways, I have never heard so much ingratitude as I have in recent years, in a place where people actually have more to be thankful for than many other parts of the world. I mean, I know America has problems, and it's certainly not a utopia. But at the same time, we should probably not forget that we really have more than most. We really do. I remember years ago crossing the border into the United States, and back in those days, I was still down here on a work visa. The border agent looked at my passport and said, "Well, I guess you'll be applying for a green card any day now." And I said, "Well, maybe. I don't know. I don't know what the future holds." "Oh," he said, "you'll be staying. Once you see what we have here, you're going to want to live here for good." Now, of course, as a citizen of another country, my pride was a little bit wounded because the standard of living in my country is really pretty good. I mean, how dare he suggest that America might have something more to offer me? But you know something, it turns out in a lot of ways he was right. I've personally discovered that America really is a land of opportunity. Personally, I found it much easier to get ahead in this country, at least back in those days. And I was amazed by just how much access Americans have to just about anything they want. Now again, that's not to suggest that my home country is some kind of backwater where the living is hard, because that's not true either. I come from a really good place to live, and a lot of people would love to live there. And still, I couldn't help but notice just how much you have here in America. This really is one of the most prosperous nations in the history of the planet, probably the most prosperous. And yet at the same time, as I listened to a lot of my new American neighbors talk about their country, I heard a lot of complaining about just how bad they thought everything was. And in some ways, I found that mystifying, because as people complained about politics and the economy and the state of society and a million other things, they were also complaining about how many people were trying to sneak across the border into this country every single day. Somehow those two things don't compute. If life in America is really as horrible as some people say, then why would so many people be willing to risk everything to get here? It doesn't add up. And again, I am not going to suggest there isn't room for improvement or that we don't have some serious problems, because obviously we do. But now that it's Thanksgiving, I thought maybe for just a few moments, even just one day, you and I could try to recover the fine art of gratitude. Because as it turns out, gratitude is something that doesn't come naturally to most of us. Surprisingly, it's something you have to practice. Human nature being what it is, it seems like we have this tendency to gravitate more toward discontentment than we do toward contentment. And a state of constant discontent will almost always give you a miserable existence. So, the question we need to ask ourselves, in light of the fact that none of us gets more than a few short years on this planet, the question is, why in the world would anybody want to live a miserable life when there's a much better alternative? I'm reminded of a story in the Bible where this group of men suddenly approaches Jesus, and they have a very serious problem. All of them are outcasts from society, and The reason they're outcasts is because they have leprosy. Now, back in that day, it was an incurable disease, and it was also transmissible. So it meant that victims had to be run out of town to go live somewhere else in a leper colony. That was the only option available to them. And I mean, talk about social distancing. If these people ever came near another group, they had to announce their presence by crying out, "Unclean, unclean," so that people could get out of the way and save themselves. I mean, we think the current pandemic is inconvenient, but imagine having a deadly disease that completely isolates you from the rest of civilization forever. There was no coming home. And there was no cell phone, no Zoom, you were out. So, here's the story as you find it in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 17. It says, "Now it happened as he," that's talking about Jesus, "went to Jerusalem, that he passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee. Then as he entered a certain village, there met him 10 men who were lepers, who stood afar off." Now, of course, they had to stand afar off because they had a deadly contagious disease. So, here they have a legitimate problem, something to be legitimately unhappy about. It continues in verse 13. "And they lifted up their voices and said, 'Jesus, Master, have mercy on us.' So when he saw them, he said to them, 'Go, show yourselves to the priests.'" Because you see, in order to be restored to society and declared healthy, it required an examination from a priest. And so it was, it says, that as they went, they were cleansed. Now, if we had more time, there are all kinds of little details in this story we could look at. Things like, well, the fact that God really cares about human suffering and He notices when you're hurting. Or we could study the fact that these guys apparently had to start walking in the direction of the priest in order to be healed, which teaches us something about the nature of faith. It's more of an active process than passive. But for Thanksgiving, just for now, let's zero in on what happens next. This is verse 15. It says, "And one of them, when he saw that he was healed, returned." You know, it almost sounds like he turned around as soon as he knew he was better before he ever got to the priest. And with a loud voice glorified God and fell down on his face at his feet, giving him thanks. And he was a Samaritan. Now, that last phrase is not just a passing comment. Just in case some of the culture of the biblical world might be new to some of you, let me just take a moment and explain what a Samaritan was. Back when the Assyrian Empire attacked the 10 northern tribes and took those people captive, they repopulated the region with a bunch of outsiders they brought in from other parts of their empire. And over time, because of these people's proximity to the tribe of Judah to the south of them, these new outsiders kind of developed their own version of the Jewish faith. They had their own sacred mountain, their own version of the scriptures, and their own religious rituals. But as far as the religious authorities in Jerusalem were concerned, the Samaritans were little better than Gentiles. In fact, I guess they really were Gentiles. And so Jerusalem considered these people to be ritually unclean. When the Babylonian captivity ended and the tribe of Judah came back home to rebuild Jerusalem, they actually refused to let the Samaritans participate in the reconstruction of the temple. So, the Samaritans went and built their own. People traveling from Jerusalem would go out of their way to avoid traveling through the region of Samaria if there was any other conceivable way they could get to their destination, because they didn't want to set foot on what they considered to be unclean territory. So, this one leper, the Samaritan, was somebody that most of Jesus' followers considered to be unclean, even if he didn't have leprosy. But to make matters worse, he did have this dreaded disease. And so, I guess in some ways we could say this man was considered doubly unclean. And yet, out of the 10 lepers that Jesus healed that day, this is the only guy who came back to say thanks. He's the only one. It continues now in verse 17. So Jesus answered and said, "Were there not 10 cleansed? But where are the 9? Were there not found any who returned to give glory to God except this foreigner?" Notice now how Jesus recognizes this man's outside status. And, well, that's for the benefit of those who are watching what's happening. And he, it says, Jesus said to him, "Arise, go your way. Your faith has made you well." So, here's what we've got in this story. Even though it doesn't really say it, I think we can probably assume that the other 9 lepers were not Samaritans. They probably came from a more privileged class. And yet the only one who actually practiced gratitude was the outsider, the man who had less to be thankful for than all the rest. And that might just be a really important lesson for us, some of the most privileged people who have ever lived on the face of this planet. I'll be right back after this.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. So jump online now or give us a call and start your journey of discovery.
You know, I wish I could just remember all of the details, but I remember listening to the radio a few years ago, really decades ago, and I heard this guy who, if I remember this correctly, didn't have any feet, and he was forced into a life of begging. And again, if I'm remembering this correctly, he also had some additional health challenges that made his life really unpleasant. He had nothing going right. And somebody was talking to him on the radio. I think it might have even been one of those on-the-street interviews. And they asked this guy, "Why are you so happy? What are you happy about?" And that's when this man started to recite a poem. And unfortunately, I remember just enough lines from this poem to be able to track it down and bring it in today. Some of you have probably heard this at some point in your lives, but I think it really bears repeating. It's by John Paul Moore, at least the version that I found online. And instead of hearing this in my voice, I want you to imagine the voice of a homeless man, somebody begging on a street corner, because that's the way I heard this. So when they asked this guy how in the world he could be happy, here's how he responded by saying this: "I've never made a fortune, and I'll never make one now. But it really doesn't matter, 'cause I'm happy anyhow. As I go along my journey, I'm reaping better than I've sowed. I'm drinking from the saucer, 'cause my cup has overflowed. I don't have a lot of riches, and sometimes the going's tough. But with kin and friends to love me, I think I'm rich enough. I thank God for the blessings that His mercy has bestowed. I'm drinking from the saucer, 'cause my cup has overflowed. He gives me strength and courage when the way grows steep and rough. I'll not ask for other blessings, for I'm already blessed enough. May we never be too busy to help bear another's load. Then we'll all be drinking from the saucer when our cups have overflowed." You know, I don't know about you, but when I first heard that, I suddenly realized, hey man, I'm more like the 9 lepers who never came back than I am like that Samaritan, the social outcast who took the time to say thanks. I mean, look, I'm not a wealthy man by any stretch of the imagination, and I've got lots of problems in my life, believe me. But I'm also not begging on a street corner today. And as far as the global population is concerned, I'd have to say that you and I, we're all 1%ers. I know that doesn't really mesh with most people's thinking, but it's true if you think about it. I have traveled the world and I have seen real grinding poverty, and even a hard life here in America. Difficulties here are better than some of the places I've seen. I've seen a man with 14 kids subsisting in a 10-by-10 hut. I've had poverty-stricken mothers in India run up to me as I'm walking through the village, and they try to give me their children because they can't afford to feed them, and they think I'm a rich American who can take them back home. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we sponsor a home for girls who are rescued from the horrific world of human trafficking, and most of them were forced into childhood prostitution because of the devastating poverty they were born into. Look, I've seen suffering on a scale that sometimes keeps me awake at night. I remember the day that I climbed into a cellar behind a church in Rwanda where the bones of thousands of genocide victims were stacked on shelves, and I found this tiny skull. It must have come from a 2-year-old, and it had been sliced in half by a machete. And here I am, living in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, and if I'm really honest about it, I'm probably more prone to grumbling than most of the people I've met who live in these other places. And I don't know why it is, but it always seems to me like the people who have the most spend the most time complaining. And honestly, there's something wrong with that. Every year, we dedicate just one day to thankfulness, 1 out of 365. And that's a far worse ratio than 1 out of 10. So what would happen if we actually tried to make gratitude a more regular part of daily life? What if we just took more time to recognize how good we really have it? You know, right now it seems like this country is more polarized and less happy than it ever has been, at least in my lifetime. Every so often, I go and waste a little bit of time perusing social media, and I can't help but notice that that's getting to be a very unhappy place. In fact, some days there's really nothing social about it. And one of the biggest things I'm noticing is just how many people want to blame somebody else for everything that goes wrong in their lives. It's a nonstop barrage. You're what's wrong with this country. How dare you believe what you believe? And I think it might be the illusion of anonymity that makes us behave like that online, always at each other's throats. But what if we were just more thankful? Again, I'm not saying you don't have problems, because most people do. And I'm not saying we live in some kind of paradise where nothing needs fixing, because we don't. But just how much does complaining contribute to fixing it? The answer is it doesn't. And not for a minute would I dare to pretend that I'm not part of the problem, because I am. I love grumbling. So maybe I'll be the first to admit that I need to improve my capacity for thankfulness. I know that most of you are familiar with the 10 Commandments, or at least you're aware they exist, because they're such a formative part of Western civilization, or at least they used to be. And out of those 10 Commandments, there's one that doesn't really get much airplay because, well, most people forget it. And ironically, the one we forget is the one that begins with the word remember. It says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." So now you're wondering, what in the world does that have to do with Thanksgiving? Well, for quite a few years, Jean and I have deliberately taken the time to observe the Sabbath the way it's described in that commandment. Not out of some kind of legalistic impulse to try and win points with God, but because we became convinced that the Sabbath must have been designed as a gift for humanity. After all, Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man. And so we started making the effort to keep it. On Friday night at sunset, when the biblical Sabbath begins, we deliberately put aside our work and all of our worries for 24 hours until the sun goes down the next day. And we gathered the kids in the family room. Jean would put out a special platter of food, and we lit a couple of candles in recognition of this special time. We read Bible stories, we prayed together, and I've got to say, it became a real highlight at our house. And one of the things we often did as the evening began was to just go around the circle and list what we're thankful for. I remember one time having company over, and they joined us as we lit those candles and we began to rehearse our gratitude, and I'll never forget the response. They said, "Wow, it's like you guys have Thanksgiving every single week." And it's true, we kind of did. So, try to imagine what might happen if every single week you took time off from all your problems. You didn't even let yourself think about them, and you added 52 extra Thanksgiving days every single year. What would that be like? I'll be right back after this.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages and backgrounds. Your family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon.
Today I enjoy associating with a group of Christians that really value the weekly Sabbath. They see it as a gift. And yet sometimes people will come to me and say, "Man, if you observe the Sabbath, that's got to be some kind of legalism. You're doing this to earn points with God or to get into heaven." And I guess if I was trying to impress God with religious observance, they might have a point. It would be a waste of time trying to impress God that way. But if you consider the Sabbath from a biblical point of view, if you look at how it was designed, you discover it was created as a gift. Go back to the story of Eden and you'll find two things that God gives the human race as a gift: the institution of marriage and the Sabbath. And you'll notice that both of these things are relational. And that's because of the character of God. He's a God who craves relationship. Marriage, the Bible tells us, is a picture of Christ's relationship with His church. And the Sabbath is dedicated time for building a relationship with God. Here's the way the Bible describes it now in Genesis chapter 2. It says, "Thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished. And on the seventh day God ended His work which He had done, and He rested on the seventh day from all His work which He had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it He rested from all His work which God had created and made." After the 6 days of creation, the next thing God did, He took a day off. And since the Bible tells us that God neither faints nor is weary, I've come to believe that God must have established this weekly break for us, to set an example for us. You know, when my youngest daughter was just a toddler, she had a horrible time staying in bed. So we would go up and help her say her prayers and tuck her in and then turn off the lights and head downstairs. And then 5 minutes later, she was out of her room, insisting she wasn't tired yet. So one night, I decided to help her conquer this restlessness, and I laid beside her on top of the covers. And I said, "Now you do what Daddy does." And I closed my eyes, and I took a deep breath, and she took a deep breath, and I said, "Let it out," and she let it out, and she copied me. And of course, I fell asleep and she got up and went downstairs, but you kind of get my point. I'm setting an example. And it's entirely possible that your Maker was trying to show you an example, the best way to live. Maybe He was making a specific sanctuary in time so that you could just stop trying and struggling all the time and just be His child. And you got to wonder, what would happen if you had that opportunity every single week? And what would happen if you used that dedicated time to practice gratitude? You know, I don't live an exorbitant life, but this week I had a roof over my head and I had food to eat. I shop at Target and Kohl's, but I have clothes on my back. I don't own a new car, but right now I have a reliable one. And even though I'm feeling the effects of aging like everybody else, I'm upright today and I can see the world around me and I have the gift of life. I mean, look, it is easy to find things to be unhappy about. Believe me, I'm a pro, I'm good at it. But why in the world would you waste this one short lifetime focusing on everything that's wrong? It doesn't make sense, not when you have a choice. Now look, I'm going to take one last quick break. So while I'm away, do this. Why don't you go and get a pen and paper and write down just 3 things you're thankful for. You probably have time to make it 5 or 10. Write them down. I think you're going to be surprised by what you feel by the time you're done with the list. I'll be right back after this.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. Bible prophecy can be incredibly vivid and confusing. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Our free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and our world. Study online or request them by mail and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
You know, in addition to a weekly time for gratitude and thankfulness, I take the first hour of every day for the same reason too. In the early hours before the office is open and the world starts punching me in the teeth, I head into my little study and I sit in my chair and I think about my life. You know, lately I've been reading from the book of Psalms, and some days I actually only make it through a single verse because I want to always slow down and ask myself, how does what I read actually apply to me? Then I spend a little bit of time being thankful for what I have. Believe me, my life has been hard, but there's always something to be thankful for. This is the time of year when children dress up like Puritans and Pilgrims and rehearse the stories of Plymouth Rock and the hardship of that first winter they had in the New World. And somehow, those people had less than we do by far, and yet they found more to be thankful for. And if we're honest, we'd have to admit that most of us were really like the 9 lepers who never came back. Compared to the rest of the planet, let's be honest, we live a privileged existence, and we still somehow manage to convince ourselves that our lives are lacking, that we've been done wrong. You know, there's a passage in the Old Testament that kind of describes how most of us live, and it's found in Proverbs chapter 27. It says, As in water, face reflects face, so a man's heart reveals the man. He's about to hold up a mirror so you can get a good look at yourself. Hell, he says, that's literally Sheol or the grave. Hell and destruction are never full, so the eyes of man are never satisfied. Just like the graveyards in your community never stop demanding new victims, our talent for complaining, he says, never runs out of things to be unhappy about. If you choose to look at the world from the perspective of an ungrateful heart, you're always going to come up empty and you're always going to want something more. And then, over in the New Testament, we have the example of Paul, a missionary who was persecuted relentlessly, treated miserably, and eventually put to death. And here's how this man chose to look at the world. Just listen to this. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. You know, Thanksgiving really easily is my very favorite holiday because there's something about it. It's just so pure, so uncomplicated, especially when you compare it to a busy, complicated holiday like Christmas. Thanksgiving doesn't come with half the fuss. It really seems just to be about thankfulness. I know for some people it's also about football, but really it's just about thankfulness. And as far as I'm concerned, there is nowhere near enough thankfulness anymore. Our appetite for more stuff, more things, is bottomless. But our aptitude for thankfulness could use a little work. I mean, imagine going through life content. Content. Listen, I'll tell you what. As soon as this show is over, I'm going to go and make another list of things that I can be thankful for. Maybe you should go and do the same yet again. And maybe get your whole family together. Encourage them all to do it, including that one person in your house who always has something to complain about. Make the lists, then sit down and read them together. And for goodness sake, be thankful, because it's just a better way to live. So listen, happy Thanksgiving, and thanks for joining me today. I'm Shawn Boonstra, and this has been Authentic.